I spent my career inside institutions that claim to value facts over narratives, capabilities over intentions, and evidence over emotion. What I see today in domestic enforcement rhetoric tells me those disciplines are gone. What is being sold to the public as control is, in reality, institutional decay dressed up as authority. When senior officials go on television and frame domestic unrest, immigration enforcement, and criminal activity as proof of decisive governance, I hear something very different. I hear an intelligence failure being laundered through confidence. The language is familiar because I watched it happen overseas before wars, sanctions, and covert operations failed. The same pattern is now being applied internally. When enforcement officials describe surges of personnel, arrests, and federal intervention as proof of restored order, they omit the core intelligence question: why those conditions exist in the first place. In intelligence work, response is not success. Response is an admission that earlier assessments failed when violence, fraud, or organized crime reach a point where federal agencies must override local systems. That is not evidence of strength. It is evidence that institutional trust has collapsed and that warning indicators were ignored or politically suppressed. What concerns me most is not the enforcement action itself. Governments have the right to enforce laws. What concerns me is the narrative framing that replaces analysis. Claims of massive criminal infiltration, coordinated agitators, and systemic corruption may or may not be partially true, but intelligence does not operate on assertion. It operates on corroboration, sourcing, and competing hypotheses. None of that is visible when complex domestic failures are reduced to televised certainty. That is not intelligence. That is messaging. I have seen this before in counterterrorism briefings, where worst-case assumptions were treated as confirmed facts because they justified action. I saw it in Iraq when selective intelligence was elevated and dissenting assessments buried. The damage came later when reality refused to cooperate. The same process is now internal. Enforcement is being used as proof of narrative correctness instead of being examined as a symptom of policy collapse. The strategic consequence is profound. Once institutions train themselves to believe their own talking points, they lose the ability to self-correct. Intelligence becomes a performance. Leadership becomes insulated. Analysts learn that accuracy is less valuable than alignment. That is how credibility dies. Not with scandal, but with applause. The hard lesson is this: when enforcement replaces analysis and certainty replaces verification, institutions are no longer governing reality. They are reacting to it blindly. And blind power, whether abroad or at home, always fails. When intelligence stops asking hard questions, it starts inflating threats to justify its own relevance. I recognize this pattern immediately because it is one of the oldest failures in the intelligence profession. You take a real problem, strip it of context, magnify its most alarming elements, and present it as an existential crisis. That process is not driven by facts. It is driven by institutional survival. What I see now in domestic enforcement rhetoric fits that model precisely. Threat inflation begins when analysis is subordinated to policy. Instead of asking how widespread a problem actually is, agencies focus on how dangerous it can be made to sound. Criminal activity becomes systemic infiltration. Disorder becomes organized insurgency. Protest becomes coordinated sabotage. Each step is linguistically small, but analytically catastrophic. Intelligence officers are trained to distinguish between isolated incidents, opportunistic crime, and structured adversarial networks. When those distinctions disappear from public explanations, it tells me they have already disappeared internally. In my career, inflated threat narratives were often defended as necessary to mobilize resources. That logic always corrodes judgment. Once an agency convinces itself that exaggeration serves a higher purpose, it loses the ability to measure reality. Every new data point is forced to confirm the story. Contradictions are dismissed as ignorance or disloyalty. Analysts who question scope or sourcing are sidelined. What remains is not intelligence, but advocacy wearing a badge. Domestic enforcement has now adopted the same logic I saw used to sell foreign interventions. The public is told that extraordinary measures are required because the threat is extraordinary, yet the evidentiary standards are never disclosed. Numbers are presented without baselines. Arrests are cited without explaining whether they represent improvement or failure. Violence is highlighted without comparative context. This is not accidental. Context weakens fear, and fear is the currency of politicized enforcement. The strategic consequence is internal mistrust. When citizens sense that language is being manipulated, they stop believing even accurate warnings. That is the most dangerous outcome imaginable for any intelligence system. Credibility, once lost, cannot be surged back into existence. No number of officers or operations can compensate for analytical dishonesty. The analytical breakdown is simple. Threat inflation does not make institutions stronger, it makes them brittle. They become dependent on crisis framing to justify action, and crises must then be continuously discovered or manufactured. That cycle ends the same way every time, with overreach, backlash, and exposure. The hard lesson is one intelligence professionals learn too late. Inflated threats collapse under scrutiny, and when they do, they take institutional authority with them. Power grounded in exaggeration does not endure. It implodes. One of the clearest signs that an intelligence system is failing is when public messaging replaces internal assessment. I watched this transformation occur during the years when intelligence products were quietly rewritten to align with talking points that had already been approved elsewhere. What we are seeing now domestically follows the same pattern, only this time the press appearance itself has become the intelligence product. Statements delivered to cameras are treated as if they are findings, not claims. That inversion destroys analytic discipline. Real intelligence work is slow, frustrating, and often inconclusive. It deals in probabilities, confidence levels, and gaps. It rarely produces the kind of certainty that plays well on television. When officials speak with absolute confidence about complex domestic conditions while investigations are supposedly ongoing, I know the conclusion came before the analysis. Intelligence does not work that way unless it has been subordinated to narrative control. The moment an agency begins briefing the public before it briefs itself, honestly, the process is compromised. Media exposure becomes a substitute for verification. Assertions are repeated until they sound established. Language hardens while evidence remains fluid. In my experience, this is how bad assumptions become institutionalized. Once a claim has been made publicly by a senior official, internal analysts understand the rules instantly. Their job is no longer to test the claim, their job is to support it or stay silent. I saw this mechanism operate before military escalations abroad when intelligence officers were pressured to produce assessments that would not embarrass leadership. What is different now is that the same approach is being applied internally to domestic governance. Enforcement agencies are narrating events in real time, not as investigators, but as protagonists. That shift matters. When institutions begin to see themselves as actors in a story rather than custodians of truth, analysis becomes optional. The strategic consequence is epistemic collapse. Decision makers begin to operate inside an echo chamber of their own statements. Corrections become admissions of weakness. New information is filtered through reputational risk instead of analytic value. Over time, even accurate intelligence is distrusted internally because it conflicts with what has already been said publicly. The analytical breakdown here is ruthless. Intelligence by press release cannot self-correct. It creates incentives to double down on error. It rewards confidence over accuracy. It trains institutions to believe that saying something forcefully makes it true. That belief has destroyed more operations than any external adversary ever did. The hard lesson is unavoidable. When intelligence becomes a performance, reality does not adapt, it waits. And when it finally intrudes, it does so violently, unpredictably, and without regard for how compelling the narrative once sounded. Every failed intelligence system eventually turns inward. When analysis no longer matches outcomes, institutions stop asking whether they were wrong and start asking how to protect themselves. I have seen this reflex too many times to mistake it for anything else. Bureaucratic self-protection is not an accidental byproduct of failure. It is the mechanism by which failure is hidden and prolonged. Once a narrative has been publicly committed to, the institution's priority shifts from accuracy to insulation. Responsibility is diffused. Language becomes defensive. Decisions are framed as inevitable responses to external forces rather than the result of internal misjudgment. In this environment, accountability is treated as a threat rather than a corrective. That is when intelligence work becomes impossible. Domestic enforcement agencies now operate under this same logic. When outcomes deteriorate, the explanation is never flawed assessment or misaligned policy. It is always someone else's obstruction, someone else's corruption, someone else's refusal to cooperate. That may occasionally be true, but intelligence professionals are trained to start by examining their own assumptions. When that step disappears, institutions lose their internal compass. I remember watching intelligence assessments after major operational failures being rewritten to emphasize how unpredictable the situation was, how unprecedented the conditions were, how impossible it was to foresee the outcome. Those explanations were convenient and false. In reality, warning signs were present, but acknowledging them would have implicated leadership decisions. The same dynamic now governs domestic policy failures. The system protects its hierarchy by treating collapse as sabotage rather than consequence. The strategic consequence of bureaucratic self-protection is paralysis. Once leadership cannot admit error, adaptation stops. Policy becomes reactive, not corrective. Enforcement escalates not because it works, but because backing down would require admitting the original premise was wrong. That is how institutions trap themselves into cycles of overreach. The analytical breakdown is stark. Intelligence organizations exist to reduce uncertainty, not to preserve reputations. When reputational risk becomes the dominant variable, analysis becomes performative. Data is selected for defensibility, not relevance. Internal dissent is reclassified as disloyalty. Over time, even competent professionals learn to self-censor, and the institution loses the very expertise it claims to embody. The hard lesson is brutal but necessary. Bureaucracies that prioritize self-protection over truth inevitably lose both. They may survive structurally for a time, but their authority erodes from within. By the time that erosion becomes visible to the public, it is already irreversible. Power is only effective when it is believed. That is a basic intelligence truth that applies as much at home as it does abroad. When federal authority is asserted repeatedly but outcomes do not improve, what is being demonstrated is not strength but erosion. I have watched this happen in foreign theaters where U.S. presence increased while influence declined. The same pattern now defines domestic enforcement. Surging personnel, expanding jurisdiction, and escalating operations are often presented as proof of resolve. In intelligence terms, they are indicators of system stress. If enforcement actions were producing durable results, they would not need to be constantly reaffirmed. Repetition is not reassurance, it is compensation. Institutions repeat claims of control because control is slipping. Credibility is built through consistency between assessment, action, and outcome. When those elements diverge, audiences notice, even if they cannot articulate why. Citizens begin to sense that enforcement is reactive rather than strategic. Each new operation is framed as decisive, yet the underlying conditions persist. That disconnect corrodes trust faster than open failure ever could. I learned early in my career that coercive power without credibility accelerates resistance. People stop cooperating, information dries up, intelligence collection suffers, enforcement becomes louder and less effective at the same time. This is not theory. It is observable in every environment where authority relies on force rather than legitimacy. Domestically, the overuse of federal power signals that local systems have broken down. That breakdown may have many causes, but pretending it is a sign of restored order is analytically dishonest. Intelligence professionals are trained to distinguish between temporary tactical success and strategic stability. Arrests and deployments are tactical events. Stability is measured by reduced necessity for intervention. By that metric, repeated federal surges indicate failure. The strategic consequence is institutional fatigue. Agencies exhaust resources chasing symptoms instead of causes. Officers are placed into environments where the mission is unclear and the metrics are political. Over time, that degrades professionalism and judgment. When every action is framed as historic, nothing is learned. The analytical breakdown is unforgiving. Power deployed without credible analysis becomes performative. It exists to demonstrate activity, not to solve problems. Once that threshold is crossed, escalation becomes the default response to stagnation. The hard lesson is one intelligence communities relearn painfully. Authority cannot be sustained through force alone. Without credibility, power invites defiance. And when defiance becomes normal, enforcement loses its strategic purpose entirely. When intelligence credibility collapses domestically, the damage does not remain contained. It radiates outward, reshaping how the state functions and how it is perceived. I have watched foreign governments lose legitimacy this way, and I never expected to see the same structural indicators emerge inside the United States. Yet here they are, unmistakable and accelerating. The first consequence is informational decay. When official statements are treated with skepticism by default, even accurate warnings are discounted. Citizens learn to parse language for intent rather than content. That behavior mirrors populations in states where intelligence services are politicized. It is not cynicism, it is adaptive survival. Once trust is broken, it does not matter whether the message is true. The audience is already disengaged. The second consequence is institutional fragmentation. Agencies stop sharing information freely because coordination becomes a liability. No one wants to be associated with an assessment that might later be disowned. This silos intelligence, distorts reporting chains, and delays response. I have seen this dynamic cripple counterterrorism efforts abroad. Domestically, it manifests as overlapping authority, contradictory messaging, and operational confusion. The third consequence is the normalization of emergency logic. When every challenge is framed as extraordinary, institutions lose the ability to prioritize. Resources are misallocated. Long-term planning disappears. Everything becomes urgent, which means nothing is strategic. Intelligence professionals know that permanent crisis posture is the enemy of clear thinking. It exhausts personnel and degrades judgment. These internal failures do not stay internal. Foreign intelligence services watch closely. They assess not what is said, but what is contradicted. When domestic narratives shift rapidly or collapse under scrutiny, adversaries learn that U.S. institutions are no longer aligned internally. That knowledge is exploited. Credibility abroad is eroded not by propaganda, but by observable inconsistency at home. The analytical breakdown is simple. Intelligence is an ecosystem. When trust collapses in one domain, it contaminates the rest. Domestic enforcement failures signal that analysis has been subordinated to politics. Foreign adversaries understand exactly what that means. They have seen it before. They know the vulnerabilities it creates. The hard lesson is uncomfortable. A state that cannot speak truthfully to its own population cannot project reliability beyond its borders. Strategic credibility is indivisible. Once it fractures domestically, global influence becomes performative theater. Power remains, but confidence in its judgment disappears. I have spent enough years inside intelligence institutions to know when a system has crossed the point where reform becomes harder than denial. What we are witnessing now is not a temporary distortion or a correctable imbalance. It is the cumulative result of years in which narrative convenience replaced analytic rigor and institutional comfort replaced accountability. Domestic enforcement did not reveal strength, it revealed the final stage of decay. The hard lesson intelligence professionals are trained to accept, but institutions resist, is that credibility is not restored by assertion. It is restored by admitting error, correcting course, and accepting short-term damage in exchange for long-term trust. That process is painful, politically dangerous, and personally costly for leadership, which is why it is almost never chosen voluntarily. Instead, systems double down. They escalate enforcement. They amplify rhetoric. They attribute failure to sabotage, extremism, misinformation, or disloyalty. Each explanation avoids the core truth. The assessments were wrong, the incentives were corrupt, and the institutions stopped listening to reality. I have seen this pattern play out until collapse in other countries. It never ends well. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that the United States no longer possesses the analytical humility it once demanded of others. Intelligence failures are no longer treated as warnings, but as public relations challenges. That inversion ensures repetition. When lessons are not learned internally, they are imposed externally by events. The strategic consequence is unavoidable. Institutions that cannot tell the truth to themselves cannot adapt. They become reactive, brittle, and increasingly coercive. Enforcement replaces governance. Messaging replaces intelligence. Authority becomes louder as it becomes less effective. This is not authoritarianism by design. It is dysfunction by denial. The analytical breakdown is complete. The intelligence cycle has been severed. Collection is politicized. Analysis is constrained. Dissemination is performative. Feedback is ignored. At that point, the system is no longer an intelligence system. It is an echo chamber with legal powers. The hard lesson, the one no institution wants to face, is this: credibility is not a renewable resource. Once burned through, it does not return on command. It can only be rebuilt through sustained honesty, institutional sacrifice, and leadership willing to accept blame. Absent that, enforcement will continue to reveal decay, not conceal it. That is not an ideological judgment. It is an intelligence assessment. And assessments, unlike narratives, do not negotiate with reality.